Hello, Jeff Zwerink. Welcome to Science Faith Connection, the segment of our show where we look at important scientific ideas and see how they connect to the truth of the Christian faith. I'm joined again by my colleague and friend, Ken Samples, and we're going to look at evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Ken, good to have you here today.
Hi, Jeff.
Both you and I are Christians, so we think Christianity is actually true. And one of the cornerstone building blocks of Christianity is that Jesus, the second person of the Godhead, came, lived on earth, died, and rose from the grave. That's a key fundamental feature of Christianity. So one of the questions that just kind of naturally arises in that is, how do we know the resurrection is true? I mean, we can't go back and do any tests or experiments to see whether it happened. So what confidence can we have that it actually happened?
Well, I think we can look at history. We can look at testimony. Let me mention a half a dozen things briefly that all New Testament scholars accept. So these are not just Christian scholars. These would be skeptical scholars. Maybe they're atheists, maybe they're agnostic, maybe they're theologically liberal. What are those handful? Gary Habermas, a specialist on the resurrection, he calls them minimal facts, meaning these are the things that every scholar principally accepts. The first one would be that Jesus was crucified, that he died publicly. Okay. I don't know anybody who questions that issue of Jesus' death, public crucifixion by the Romans. So we know he was dead.
So just as a quick little detour on that, I've had people challenge me that we don't even know that whether Jesus was a person or not. So if the idea that Jesus was publicly crucified, that would seem to say that there's basically the scholarship out there says, yeah, Jesus was actually a person that lived.
Yeah,
am I correct?
I know very few scholars. I mean, the idea of a Christ myth, Jesus mythology, that is a minority position. And if it were accepted to be true, then I don't know what you would do with the classical departments in our major universities. We couldn't know anything about Plato, Aristotle, anybody in the ancient world.
Okay.
Very few people question that, and none of the New Testament scholars question that Jesus died a public death, that he was crucified by the Romans. Now, a second assumption that is accepted is that some of his followers began to experience what we might call appearances. That they were seeing things. Not only was the tomb empty, but I don't want to talk about that. Some of Jesus's followers started seeing what they thought was the person of Jesus.
Okay.
And this then moves to the third point that is accepted, and that is that these appearances, these apparent resurrection appearances of Jesus, they had a transforming effect on the people who saw them. They moved, for example, from being fearful and anxious and defeated cowards, if you will, to being people who are willing to say, you know what, I'm willing to suffer martyrdom because I've seen Jesus resurrected from the dead. Now, the skeptical scholars don't believe those appearances were actually real, but they don't discount that they were having some kind of experience and it transformed their character.
So that's kind of, so you got Jesus was a public death that people claim to have seen him afterwards, and that it transformed their character. So these are presumably pieces of evidence that any good explanation has to account for.
Number 4, that all of this was very early. That is the crucifixion, the appearances, the transformation of the apostles all happened in a very close proximity of time. So it wasn't, dozens of years. Things like this were transpiring within weeks, within months. So all of this is early testimony, okay? Now, then we move a little bit further. There's particularly 2 people who are not predisposed to the resurrection. They were opposed. One would be James, the half-brother of Jesus, if you will. I mean, imagine growing up in Jesus's family. Why can't you be more like Jesus? But imagine, James thought Jesus was mentally ill, because only mentally ill people claim to be Yahweh, claim to be the great I am. But James saw the resurrected Jesus, and it totally transformed him from thinking his brother was mentally ill to thinking his brother was, in fact, the Son of God. And then the last one would be Paul. He is not predisposed to becoming a Christian. He is anti-Christian. You know, he could be perceived as being a jihadist, if you will. He wanted to arrest Christians. He thought this is a cult. These people ought to be killed if they won't repent. What happens? He sees the resurrected Jesus in his testimony, and it totally transforms him. So those are the 6 minimal facts that everybody accepts. Now, again, I'm not saying that the agnostic, atheist, liberal scholars accept the Christian interpretation of those facts, but they agree, yep, Christ was crucified. Yes, it appears that his disciples had genuine appearances. There is evidence of transformation, and this all happened in a very early context. And James and Paul had no reason to accept this other than for the claims they made. That's a lot of assumptions to accept, and they are accepted by critical scholars as well.
So it sounds like there are certain explanations or certain ways of accounting or dealing with Christianity, if you're skeptical of it, that we can just kind of outright reject because they don't line up with the facts. So, for example, Jesus didn't actually exist. That just doesn't seem to accord with the scholarship, or the fact that Jesus wasn't crucified, or that Paul wasn't radically, so things that don't account for those facts, we can just kind of outright reject because that just seems poor scholarship. But it does seem like there are even within that, there are explanations that account for those that say the resurrection didn't happen. As a scientist, one of the things you do is you say, all right, how can we continue to test this and find this explanation is better than the other? How do we go, can we apply a scientific approach to analyzing that and get closer to the truth of what actually happened?
Well, I think you can, in the sense that you can use kind of an abductive approach, that is, what is the best explanation? So it's true, Jeff, that these critical scholars, they look at these appearances and they say, well, they weren't really seeing Jesus. Maybe they were having some kind of religious visions or religious experience, but it really wasn't authentic. I guess maybe they could say, maybe they were having some kind of psychological experience that wasn't based in reality. Or they may say that maybe the transformation, I don't know what they would say about James and Paul. The transformation is so profound. But now the question is, well, is there any alternative explanation? Is there alternative theories that we can accept? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think the evidence for the resurrection is so powerful, is all the alternative explanations I've seen seem so inadequate to be able to really explain these kinds of things. I don't know how you would explain authentically the transformation of James and Paul. I mean, they were not predisposed to believe. James thought his brother was mentally ill. Paul thought these were heretics. And yet they had some kind of visionary experience that transformed their lives. So name whatever alternative explanation you want. I think that those are all really rather inadequate or shallow.
Well, thanks, Ken. I appreciate your comments. When we look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, it seems like there is quite an abundance of evidence for that. And it really does point to Christianity's, that Jesus actually rose from the dead is the best explanation for all of those facts. Ken listed 6 of them, but I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out his blog, A Dozen Evidences for the Resurrection of Jesus, to get more evidence that supports that Jesus actually rose from the dead, so that we can go out and tell people how they can have a relationship with God through Jesus.